The first time we met, I never imagined we'd end up here. I was standing at the edge of the roof, wind biting at my skin, tears streaming down my face. I hadn't meant to be there. I hadn't meant to be on the brink of making the most irreversible decision of my life. The night had swallowed me whole and my mind was a storm, dark, suffocating. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, louder than the city below, a deafening rhythm that almost drowned out the voice that cut through the noise. "Hey, you okay?" It wasn't supposed to be him. This wasn't the kind of place where anyone came to rescue someone. I turned to face him, tall, disheveled, yet somehow carrying an energy that grounded me. His eyes, soft yet intent, didn't seem like they belonged in the middle of a crisis. He wasn't just a random person from the crowd. There was something about him. I could see it before he even said a word. I'm not sure why I didn't push him away, why I didn't just scream at him to leave me alone. But in that moment, I didn't want to be alone anymore. I didn't want the darkness to keep swallowing me, so I let him stay. We didn't talk at first. He stood there beside me quietly, without pressing me. I don't know how long we stood like that. He never tried to hold me, never tried to touch me. He was just there, a steady presence like a flickering light in a storm. And then, in the midst of all that chaos, he asked me a question. What would happen if you stayed? His voice was so calm, so real that I found myself answering before I could even think it through. "I don't know," I whispered. I wanted to tell him about the years of loneliness, the silence that always seemed too loud, the longing that never seemed to end. But I didn't have to. He understood. Or maybe it was that, in some strange way, he had been there too. The connection between us was almost electric, but not in the way you might think. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. It was pure, raw, and vulnerable. Two strangers connecting in a moment of deep despair, when the world felt like it was unraveling. And for the first time in ages, I felt seen, truly seen. But then came the twist. He wasn't just a stranger to me. He was someone I'd seen before. It wasn't in passing or a chance encounter. No, this was different. The last time I had seen him was months ago, at a party. I remembered his face vividly, but in that moment, I couldn't recall his name. The night had been a blur of drunken conversations and meaningless exchanges. He had been a fleeting figure, someone I had barely noticed in the chaos of everything else. Yet here he was, standing beside me in the most unexpected place. And that realization hit me harder than anything else. What were the odds of meeting someone like this twice? It felt like fate, a force beyond my control. Something inside me stirred, the kind of feeling that doesn't make sense but makes everything feel connected. It wasn't until later, after we had spent hours just talking about everything and nothing, that he confessed to me that he hadn't come up to the roof by accident. "I knew you'd be here," he admitted quietly. "I've been watching you for a while." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean, watching me?" I asked, half afraid of what he was going to say. He seemed to notice my fear, quickly clarifying. "Not in a creepy way. I noticed you. I saw the way you carry yourself, the way you hide in plain sight. I felt like I understood you." My heart skipped. The words sounded like something out of a movie, but this wasn't a movie. This was real life. And in real life, people didn't just find each other like this. Or did they? We sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of his words hanging between us, more significant than anything I had expected to hear. His confession didn't send me running as I thought it might. Instead, it seemed to strip away the final layers I had left, leaving me exposed, raw, vulnerable. I looked at him again, really looked at him this time, his eyes wide, searching. yet filled with something I couldn't quite place. He wasn't like the others I'd met, the ones who made promises they couldn't keep, the ones who only wanted to be close when it was convenient for them. He was different. The connection felt deeper, something unspoken, almost spiritual. There was a kind of honesty about him that I hadn't encountered before. But how could I trust it? How could I trust him? Then he did something I would never have expected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled, worn envelope. My heart raced as he handed it to me. I didn't open it immediately, but I could feel the tension building between us, as if whatever was inside had the power to change everything. "This," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is why I came up here tonight." I stared at the envelope, half expecting some dramatic reveal, letters, photographs, or a confession. But there was no clue on the outside of it to prepare me for what was inside. With trembling hands, I tore open the flap. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly, and as I unfolded it, my eyes widened in shock. It was a letter that I had written months ago, when I thought I had lost forever. I had written it in a moment of hopelessness, scribbling out words on a napkin in the depths of despair, words about how I felt, how I thought I was doomed to be alone forever. I hadn't even remembered what I had written until I saw those same words staring back at me now. "Where did you get this?" I demanded, a rush of disbelief flooding through me. I felt my stomach knotting. How could he have this? How could he have known? He took a deep breath, his eyes not leaving mine, and he said simply, "You don't remember, do you, that night at the party? You left it on the bar." My chest tightened as pieces began to fall into place. That night I had been so drunk, my mind fogged, the world spinning around me. I had written that letter as a kind of release, thinking no one would ever see it. And yet here it was, returned to me in the hands of this stranger. My mind raced. The odds of him finding it, of him even noticing me that night, seemed impossible. And yet here we were. What was the connection between us? What cosmic thread had pulled us together? But it didn't stop there. As if that wasn't enough to unsettle me, he continued, his voice even quieter now. "I've been trying to find you ever since." My heart pounded in my chest, the question hanging in the air. "Why?" I breathed, barely able to keep my voice steady. He looked at me, his expression almost pained, as if he was fighting with himself over how much to reveal. "Because you're not the only one who felt lost that night." His words hit me like a tidal wave. I was there too. I wrote my own letter, a letter just like yours. And when I saw you leave it behind, I knew I had to find you. I thought maybe you were the person who could understand me the way no one else could. The ground beneath me seemed to shift. He had been hiding in plain sight just as I had. Two strangers, worlds apart, yet brought together by a single, forgotten piece of paper. The twist was too much to process. How could he have known? How could he have felt the same exact way? We were two lost souls searching for something, anything that could anchor us. And somehow we had found each other. But this felt like something more than fate. It felt like destiny. As I processed what he'd just said, something inside me stirred, an overwhelming mix of confusion, fear, and awe. How could we both have been so lost, so alone at the same time? And how was it possible that, out of all the places in the world, our paths had crossed again? This wasn't just coincidence. It was as if we were two puzzle pieces that, against all odds, had finally fit together. But that realization didn't offer me the peace I thought it would. It only raised more questions, and with them, a strange sense of urgency. I wanted to know everything about him, every detail, every thought, but I was also terrified. Terrified of the intimacy that was beginning to form between us. Terrified of the unknown. We had been two strangers on the same rooftop, but now we were something more. We were two people whose lives had been shaped by silence, by brokenness. And now, in each other, we were beginning to find pieces of ourselves we had lost along the way. He must have sensed my hesitation because he leaned in a little closer, his voice soft, almost as if he were afraid to disturb the fragile moment we had shared. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said, "and I don't want to rush you into anything, but I need you to understand something. I've spent months thinking about this moment about you, and I don't want to walk away from it without at least trying, without at least seeing if this, us, could be something real." His words hit me harder than anything else. The idea of us was impossible to ignore, yet terrifying to embrace. What if we weren't meant to be together? What if everything we'd built up in our minds was just another illusion, another failed attempt to find meaning in a world that had offered us so little? But then I realized something that took my breath away. What if it wasn't an illusion? What if this was the real thing? My mind spun with uncertainty, but something inside me also recognized the truth of what he was saying. Every part of my body, every instinct told me that this connection, however strange, however sudden, was something I couldn't let slip away. It wasn't just his confession, his letter, or even his presence beside me that made me believe. It was the way he saw me, truly saw me, in a way that no one ever had before. He wasn't asking for my perfection or for me to be anything other than what I was, a person who had been broken, who had been lost, and who had tried so many times to piece themselves back together. And in return, he offered me the same acceptance. He saw my darkness, and still, he chose to stay. But just as the tension between us started to simmer, a sudden, jarring voice broke through the moment. "You can't be serious," a woman's voice interrupted from behind us, sharp and biting. I turned to see her, someone I knew from my past, someone who had always made it clear that she thought I was nothing more than a passing phase. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene before her, and her tone dripped with disdain. "You're really going to do this? You're really going to throw away everything for this?" Her words stung, but not in the way I expected. Instead of making me retreat into myself, her judgment felt like a call to action. It was like she was daring me to walk away from what was unfolding, daring me to choose the life I had always known, the life of fear, of loneliness, of holding back. But that wasn't who I was anymore. Not after everything we had shared tonight. Not after he had stepped into my life, showing me that there was more out there than I had ever dared to imagine. And in that moment, with her harsh words echoing in the air, something inside me snapped. I realized that if I kept running, kept hiding behind the walls I had built, I would never know what could come of this, of us. I turned back to him, my eyes meeting his, and for the first time that night I smiled. A real smile, one that felt like it was coming from deep within, one that said, "I'm ready, ready to take the leap, ready to believe that sometimes the most unexpected connections are the ones that change everything." As the tension between us and the woman behind me lingered, I knew something had shifted. Her judgmental gaze cut through the air like a knife, but it no longer held the power to control me. For years, I had lived my life in the shadow of other people's opinions, people who thought they knew what was best for me, people who had never once understood the pain I carried. But now, standing here on this rooftop, I realized that none of that mattered. What mattered was this moment, the one I was sharing with him, the stranger who had become so much more. And in the space between us, in that fragile, breathtaking silence, I understood something profound. Love, true love, wasn't about following the rules or seeking approval from the world. It was about daring to choose something that felt right, even if it seemed impossible. The woman, still hovering in the background, sneered and shook her head in disbelief. "You're throwing your life away," she spat, her voice harsh. But I wasn't listening anymore. I couldn't afford to. In her eyes, I was still the person I had once been, the person who would fold, who would hide, who would keep choosing safety over truth. But I wasn't that person anymore. Not after everything that had led me here. Not after the letter, the rooftop, the moments of vulnerability we had shared. I turned my gaze away from her and looked at him again. His eyes were steady, unwavering. He wasn't asking for anything more than the truth of who I was. And in that quiet exchange, something clicked. There was no grand speech, no dramatic moment of clarity. It was simply the certainty that I couldn't go back. I couldn't unsee what I had seen. And just as I was about to speak, to finally let my heart break free, he did something I never expected. He reached for my hand, but not in the way I thought he would. It wasn't a gesture of affection or romantic longing. No, it was a touch of reassurance, of knowing that what we were about to face wasn't going to be easy. "I'm here," he said softly, his words steady as they met my ears. "No matter what happens, I'm here." And in that moment, everything else faded away. The woman, the doubt, the past, all of it seemed irrelevant compared to the truth that stood before me. I squeezed his hand tightly, an unspoken promise passing between us. He had made his choice, and so had I. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything around us shifted. The city seemed quieter, the wind softer, the air between us charged with a new electric energy. The rooftop that had once been a symbol of my darkest thoughts, my most desperate moments, had transformed into a sacred space, a place where I had found not just someone else, but myself. A few moments earlier, I had been teetering on the edge, unsure of whether I wanted to live or let go. Now I was standing firm. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally choosing something for myself, choosing a life that was mine to build and not one dictated by the voices of others. We stood there together, hand in hand, knowing the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but confident that we had the courage to walk it. The woman, realizing she wasn't going to sway me, huffed and stormed off, leaving us alone in the night. As her footsteps echoed into the distance, I realized that what had seemed impossible a few hours ago was now undeniable. We were strangers no longer. We had crossed an invisible line, a threshold into a new world where love didn't ask for permission, didn't seek validation. It just was. We hadn't expected this. We hadn't planned for it. But we had found each other in the most unexpected of ways, in a moment of brokenness, in the messiness of life, and through the sheer force of connection. The leap we had taken wasn't just about a romantic gesture. It was about choosing something deeper, something that might defy all logic, all reason, but that felt right in ways we couldn't yet fully explain. And as we stood there, hands entwined, watching the night unfold before us, it was clear. What had started as an accidental meeting, a desperate cry for help, had turned into something neither of us could have ever anticipated: true love in all its messy, unexpected glory. And in that moment, I knew that this wasn't the end of our story. It was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. I often found myself reflecting on that night, on how, against all odds, we had come together. The world around us seemed to shrink and grow at the same time, shrinking with the weight of the struggles we were facing, but expanding with the possibilities we had only just begun to explore. People around us started to notice, began to whisper, and the judgments, both from old friends and new acquaintances, didn't stop. But none of it mattered anymore. It wasn't about proving something to the world, it was about proving it to ourselves. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to love. I wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. He taught me that love wasn't about perfection. It was about being seen for who you truly are, with all your flaws, your scars, and your fears. And he did that for me. And I did it for him too. It wasn't easy, of course. There were moments where doubt crept in, moments where we both had to confront the walls we had built around ourselves. Trust didn't come overnight. It was earned, piece by piece. But it was real. Every time I saw him, every time he touched me, I felt like I was finally waking up. Slowly but surely, the darkness that had once defined me began to lift, replaced by a warmth I hadn't known was possible. We started sharing everything, the little things, the fears we had once kept hidden, the dreams we were too afraid to speak aloud. We weren't just lovers. We were companions on this wild journey of self-discovery, and I started to believe that maybe this us wasn't a mistake after all. Maybe this was the way it was always meant to be. Then came the day when the unexpected happened again. We were sitting in a park, laughing, enjoying a simple afternoon when I noticed a familiar face walking by, a face I hadn't seen in months, not since that party. It was the woman who had judged us on the rooftop, the one who had questioned everything we were. She paused when she saw us, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of us sitting together, laughing, at peace. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. I could see the look in her eyes, the disbelief, the judgment still hanging heavy. But this time it didn't bother me. This time it didn't break me. Instead, I smiled. Not a smug smile, not one of triumph, but a genuine, quiet smile, because I realized something I hadn't before. She didn't hold any power over me anymore. We had found something so much stronger than her opinion. We had found each other. Her gaze lingered for a moment, then she walked on without a word. And as I watched her disappear into the distance, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not for her, but for everything that had led me to this moment. The pain, the loneliness, the fear, and most importantly, the leap. The leap that had brought me to him. To us. And in that silence, in the space between her and us, I understood the real lesson. It wasn't about finding love in the conventional ways. It wasn't about meeting someone at the right time or checking off some list of expectations. It was about taking the leap, even when the ground felt uncertain beneath your feet, and trusting that the fall would lead you to exactly where you were meant to be. And now, as I stand here with him, no longer a stranger, no longer lost, I realize that the leap we took together wasn't just a leap of faith. It was a leap towards something bigger than either of us had ever imagined. Something deeper, something that would shape the rest of our lives. From strangers to lovers, from brokenness to healing, from fear to freedom. We had taken the leap, and in the end, it wasn't just love we found. It was ourselves together.